The winter of 1874 hit brutal in the upper Midwest foothills when homesteader Jonas Fletcher learned his iron stove had failed him completely. He had built exactly like every settler was told: cast iron stove, steady wood fires, stack cords when the cold came. By morning, frost coated the inside walls. His water bucket froze solid 3 feet from the stove, and his family shivered under every blanket they owned. Across the frontier, homesteaders were burning through wood faster than they could cut it, yet still waking to frozen cabins that felt colder than root cellars. Over the next year, Fletcher quietly applied an old world technique using clay and stone to build what his neighbors mocked as a ridiculous mud bench. The difference was measurable. His cabin stayed 35 degrees warmer on the coldest nights while using half the wood. What did he understand about heat storage that every other frontier builder had completely missed? The accepted wisdom across the northern frontier had never been questioned because it seemed to work well enough for those who survived to talk about it. Every trading post, every supply merchant, every experienced homesteader who made it through more than 2 winters would tell newcomers the same thing. Get yourself a good iron stove, stack your wood high before the snow flies, and keep that fire burning steady through the cold months. The logic appeared sound enough. Wood was plentiful in most areas. Iron stoves were efficient compared to open fireplaces, and the method had carried thousands of families through harsh seasons without anyone freezing to death in their sleep. But Fletcher had begun to notice something troubling about this so-called proven approach during his second winter on the claim. Even on nights when he followed every rule perfectly, loading the stove with seasoned oak and banking the coals just right, the cold would creep through the cabin walls like water through a sieve. His wife would wake him before dawn, shivering despite the heavy wool blankets they had brought from Pennsylvania, and he would find the interior air so frigid that his breath fogged thick as smoke. The wooden floor felt like walking on ice, and any water left in basins or buckets would be solid by morning, regardless of how much fuel he had burned the night before. What troubled Fletcher most was the sheer volume of wood the standard method demanded. His neighbors were cutting and splitting from dawn to dusk just to keep their stoves fed, and still they complained of cold mornings and restless sleep. The Andersons, who lived a quarter-mile downstream, had burned through 4 full cords by February and were already eyeing trees that should have lasted them through the following year. The Kowalski family had taken to sleeping in shifts, with someone awake all night to tend the fire, because they had learned that letting it die meant waking to interior temperatures that could freeze a man's lungs. Fletcher's own background had prepared him to question what everyone else accepted without thought. His father had emigrated from the Rhine Valley region of Germany, where winter meant something entirely different from these American frontier cold snaps. The old man had often described the massive stone stoves that heated his childhood home, great masonry structures built into the walls themselves that would radiate warmth for days after a single firing. Those stoves, his father claimed, could heat a house with less wood in a month than American settlers burned in a week. The principle, as his father explained it, was not to heat air that would immediately escape through every crack and gap, but to heat stone and clay that would hold the warmth and give it back slowly, hour after hour, long after the flames had died. When Fletcher began talking about applying these old-world methods to his own cabin, the reaction from his neighbors ranged from polite skepticism to outright mockery. The idea of building what they called a mud bench seemed like frontier madness to settlers who prided themselves on practical efficiency. Why waste good floor space on a pile of clay and rocks when a proper iron stove could heat a room just fine? The supply merchants in the nearest town 20 miles south laughed openly when Fletcher asked about clay suitable for construction work. They sold iron stoves and iron pipe and iron grates, they told him, not pottery supplies for playing in the mud like a child. But Fletcher had reached his limit with the standard method's failures. On a particularly brutal stretch in late January, when outside temperatures dropped below zero for 6 consecutive nights, his iron stove proved utterly inadequate despite burning constantly. The family huddled together on a single mattress, dragged close to the stove, yet still woke with frost on their hair and numbness in their fingers and toes. His wife developed a persistent cough from breathing the cold air, and their youngest child cried through the nights from the chill that seemed to seep up through the floorboards no matter how much wood Fletcher fed the flames. That was when Fletcher decided to build something entirely different from what frontier wisdom recommended. Instead of depending on continuous fire to heat air that would immediately cool, he would capture the heat itself and store it in mass that could release warmth gradually throughout the coldest hours. He began gathering clay from a deposit he had noticed along the creek bank, clay that turned thick and workable when mixed with water and dried hard as brick when exposed to heat. He collected stones from the same creek, flat pieces that could be fitted together, and round cobbles that would add weight and thermal mass to his planned construction. The bench Fletcher envisioned would not simply sit beside his stove like a piece of furniture. Instead, he would build it as an integral part of his heating system, with internal channels that would force the stove's hot exhaust gases to travel through the clay and stone mass before escaping up the chimney. This meant the heat that normally disappeared straight up the chimney would be captured and stored in the bench, turning every firing into a heat reservoir that could warm the cabin for hours after the flames died. The conflict Fletcher faced was not merely technical, but philosophical. The entire frontier approach to heating rested on the assumption that you heated air and burned fuel continuously to maintain warmth. Fletcher's approach would reverse that logic completely. Rather than heating air that cooled quickly, he would heat mass that cooled slowly. Rather than burning fuel continuously, he would burn intensely for shorter periods and let stored heat carry the load. Rather than accepting that winter meant constant cold punctuated by brief warm spells near the fire, he would create sustained warmth that lasted through the night. This shift represented a fundamental challenge to everything his neighbors believed about surviving frontier winters, and Fletcher understood that building his clay and stone bench would put those beliefs to the ultimate test. Fletcher's first challenge was not gathering the materials, but understanding exactly how different substances would behave when subjected to intense heat and then asked to hold that heat over time. The clay he had identified along the creek bank was dense and fine-grained, but clay alone would crack and crumble when exposed to the extreme temperature changes his system would demand. He needed something that would bind the clay together while adding thermal mass, and his father's descriptions of Rhine Valley construction had mentioned mixing chopped straw into clay plaster to prevent cracking. But Fletcher was building something far more ambitious than wall plaster. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An elderly Potawatomi man named McGeezy, who sometimes traded at the settlement, observed Fletcher testing clay mixtures behind his cabin and offered a crucial insight. McGeezy's people had built earth lodges and fired pottery for generations, and he explained that the secret was not just in the clay mixture, but in the stones themselves. River stones that had been tumbled smooth would expand and contract at different rates than the clay, eventually breaking the structure apart. But stones that had been exposed to fire before, stones from old hearths or fire rings, would behave more predictably when heated again. These fire-tested stones could be embedded directly in clay without the expansion problems that would destroy the bench from within. McGeezy also shared knowledge that Fletcher's German heritage had not provided: how to judge clay by its feel and behavior when wet. The finest clay would feel smooth between the fingers but not slippery, and when rolled into a thin rope, it should bend without cracking until it formed nearly a complete circle. This test would ensure the clay had enough binding strength to hold together around the stones, but not so much that it would shrink excessively during drying and create gaps where heat could escape. Fletcher began his construction by digging out a foundation area 18 inches deep and 4 feet wide, running the full 8-foot length of his planned bench. Into this excavation, he placed a base layer of fire-tested stones, each piece roughly the size of his fist, fitted together as tightly as possible with minimal gaps. Over this stone foundation, he began building up layers of clay mixed with chopped grass and small gravel, creating a matrix that would bond the stones together while providing countless tiny air spaces that would slow heat conduction and help the mass retain warmth longer. The internal flue system proved to be the most technically demanding aspect of the entire construction. Fletcher had to create channels within the clay and stone mass that would allow hot gases from his stove to travel through the bench before exiting through the chimney. But these channels had to be sized precisely. Too narrow, and the gases would back up into his cabin, creating dangerous smoke conditions. Too wide, and the gases would move too quickly to transfer their heat to the surrounding mass. Working from his father's half-remembered descriptions and his own experimentation, Fletcher settled on flue channels approximately 6 inches wide and 4 inches high, lined with flat stones to prevent the clay from slumping when wet. The flue design Fletcher developed consisted of a main channel that entered the bench directly from his stovepipe, then split into 3 parallel passages that snaked through the clay and stone mass in a series of gentle curves. These passages eventually rejoined into a single exit channel that connected to his existing chimney. The serpentine path would force the hot exhaust gases to spend additional time in contact with the thermal mass, transferring more heat before the gases finally escaped. As Fletcher built up the bench layer by layer, he paid careful attention to the proportions that would determine its effectiveness. The final structure measured 24 inches thick, with the bottom 12 inches consisting primarily of large stones bonded with clay, and the top 12 inches featuring a denser mixture of smaller stones and clay that would provide a smooth, warm surface for sitting or sleeping. The total mass of clay and stone reached nearly 3 tons, creating a thermal reservoir far beyond anything a simple iron stove could match. Fletcher's first test came on a March evening when outside temperatures dropped to near freezing. He loaded his stove with seasoned oak and maintained a steady fire for exactly 2 hours, timing the burn carefully to see how long the stored heat would last. When he allowed the fire to die completely, the surface of the bench registered 92 degrees Fahrenheit using a simple mercury thermometer he had acquired from the town doctor. 6 hours later, the bench surface still measured 73 degrees, while the air temperature in a similar cabin without a bench had dropped to 41 degrees. More significantly, Fletcher discovered that the thermal mass created a fundamentally different heating experience from what any iron stove could provide. Instead of the sharp temperature swings that characterized conventional heating, where areas close to the stove became uncomfortably hot while distant corners remained cold, the bench provided gentle, even warmth that radiated outward in all directions. His family could sleep directly on the bench surface, using only light blankets while remaining comfortable throughout the night. The fuel consumption results exceeded even Fletcher's expectations. Where he had previously burned through nearly half a cord of wood per week, maintaining continuous fires, the thermal mass system required only 1.5 cords per month, a reduction of roughly 70%. The intensive but brief firing periods meant he could burn hotter, more complete fires that produced less smoke and ash while extracting maximum heat from each piece of fuel. By late spring, Fletcher had demonstrated that thermal mass storage was not theoretical, but practical, measurable, and dramatically superior to the conventional approach that had frustrated homesteaders throughout the region. Fletcher's success with the thermal mass bench revealed a new problem that threatened to undermine everything he had accomplished. During his first autumn tests, he noticed that while the bench itself performed exactly as intended, the cabin's interior temperature still fluctuated far more than it should. Heat was escaping through dozens of small gaps and cracks that he had never paid attention to when relying on continuous stove fires. With the new system's longer periods between firings, these air leaks became critical flaws that could waste half the stored heat before morning. The most significant heat loss occurred through the gaps between the log walls themselves. Frontier cabin construction typically relied on chinking, a mixture of mud and sticks stuffed between logs, but this crude sealing method left countless tiny channels where warm air could escape and cold air could enter. Fletcher could feel drafts throughout the cabin on windy nights, and he realized that no amount of thermal mass could compensate for an envelope that leaked like a basket. McGeesy provided Fletcher with knowledge that would prove crucial for solving this envelope problem. The Potawatomi had developed sophisticated techniques for creating weatherproof walls in their earth lodges and winter houses, using specific clay and fiber mixtures that could seal surfaces completely while remaining flexible enough to move with the structure during seasonal expansion and contraction. The key ingredient that Fletcher had been missing was not just clay, but the right combination of clay with organic fibers that would create a truly airtight barrier. The plaster mixture that McGeesy demonstrated consisted of 3 parts: clay to 1 part sand, with chopped prairie grass and even finely shredded bark mixed in to create a matrix that would not crack as it dried. But the application technique was equally important. Rather than simply stuffing this mixture into gaps like traditional chinking, It had to be applied in thin, smooth coats over the entire interior wall surface, creating a continuous membrane that eliminated air infiltration entirely. Fletcher began the plastering process by preparing his walls, removing all the old chinking and scraping the log surfaces clean so the new plaster would bond properly. He then applied the clay mixture in 3 separate coats, each one thinner than his thumb. The first coat filled the major gaps and irregularities, the second coat smoothed the surface, and the third coat provided a finished surface that could be kept clean and maintained over time. Each coat had to dry completely before the next application, a process that took nearly a month to complete throughout the cabin. The floor presented an entirely different challenge. Fletcher discovered that moisture rising from the ground was not only making his clay bench damp, but also creating conditions that allowed heat to conduct directly into the earth below the cabin. Traditional frontier floors consisted of nothing more than wooden planks laid over floor joists, with open space beneath that allowed moisture, cold air, and even small animals to move freely under the living space. Fletcher's solution drew from both McGeezy's earth lodge techniques and his own German heritage knowledge of cellar construction. He created a moisture barrier by digging out the entire floor area to a depth of 6 inches, then filling this excavation with a carefully graded mixture of gravel and clay that would shed water away from the cabin while providing an insulating layer between the interior and the cold ground. Over this base, he laid flat stones fitted tightly together, creating a thermal mass floor that would absorb heat from the bench and radiate it back slowly, while completely preventing moisture infiltration. The windows and door required the most precise work, since these openings were necessary but represented the largest potential sources of heat loss. Fletcher created custom sealing systems using leather strips and wool felt, materials that could compress tightly against window frames and door jambs while still allowing the openings to function normally. For the windows, he cut thin leather gaskets that fit exactly into the gaps between the glass panes and the wooden frame, then covered these with wool batting that could be compressed when the window was closed. The door received even more attention since it was used frequently and had to maintain its seal despite constant opening and closing. Fletcher built a double threshold system with an inner wooden threshold and an outer stone threshold, creating a pocket of trapped air that served as additional insulation. He also constructed a simple but effective weather seal using a long leather flap that hung from the inside of the door and pressed against the threshold when the door was closed. The results of these envelope improvements became apparent during Fletcher's first systematic test in early November, with the same bench firing routine he had developed earlier. But with the newly sealed cabin envelope, interior temperatures remained steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the night, while a similar cabin without envelope sealing dropped to 51 degrees using identical heating. The sealed envelope had added 12 degrees of retained heat without requiring any additional fuel. More importantly, the envelope improvements eliminated the uncomfortable drafts and cold spots that had made frontier cabins unpleasant even when adequately heated. Fletcher's family could now move freely throughout the cabin without encountering pockets of cold air, and they could sleep anywhere in the room rather than being forced to cluster near the heat source. The moisture control provided by the sealed floor system proved equally valuable. Fletcher's clay bench remained completely dry throughout the wet autumn months, ensuring that its thermal mass properties remained consistent. Neighboring cabins with traditional floors reported problems with dampness, mold, and even structural damage to their heating systems, while Fletcher's integrated system showed no signs of moisture-related deterioration. By combining the thermal mass bench with comprehensive envelope sealing, Fletcher had created something that transcended either technique alone. The bench provided heat storage and radiant warming, while the sealed envelope ensured that this stored heat remained inside the living space where it was needed. Together, these elements formed a heating system that could maintain comfortable temperatures using 60% less fuel than conventional frontier heating methods, while providing far superior comfort and reliability throughout the harsh winter months that lay ahead. Fletcher's success with the sealed envelope created an entirely new set of challenges that he had not anticipated during his initial planning. The combination of thermal mass heating and airtight construction meant that his cabin now retained not only heat, but also smoke, cooking odors, moisture from breathing and daily activities, and potentially dangerous gases that could accumulate to lethal levels. The very effectiveness of his envelope sealing had eliminated the natural air exchange that frontier cabins typically relied upon to maintain breathable indoor air. The first sign of trouble appeared during a December evening when Fletcher was testing his system during a particularly still night with no wind to assist his chimney draft. As he built up his fire for the evening burn cycle, he noticed that smoke was not drawing cleanly through the flue channels as it had during his earlier tests. Instead, wisps of smoke began seeping from the joints between his stovepipe and the bench entry point, and the cabin began filling with a haze that made his family's eyes water and triggered persistent coughing. Fletcher quickly discovered that his sealed envelope had created a negative pressure situation that interfered with proper chimney function. When his cabin had been drafty, outside air could enter freely to replace the hot gases being drawn up the chimney. Now that every crack had been sealed with clay plaster, there was insufficient replacement air to maintain the upward draft that his flue system required. The fire was essentially suffocating from lack of oxygen, producing incomplete combustion that generated dangerous carbon monoxide instead of clean heat. The solution required Fletcher to completely rethink how air moved through his living space. He needed to provide controlled air intake that would supply enough oxygen for proper combustion and chimney draft, while maintaining the envelope's ability to retain heat and prevent random cold air infiltration. This meant designing a ventilation system that could be adjusted based on weather conditions, fire intensity, and indoor air quality needs. Working with a traveling tinsmith named Klaus Weber, who had learned metalworking techniques in Bavaria and understood the principles of controlled airflow from European stove design, Fletcher developed a system of adjustable air intake vents. These vents consisted of rectangular openings cut through the cabin wall near floor level, each fitted with a sliding metal plate that could be opened or closed to regulate airflow. The vents were positioned to draw cold outside air directly toward the stove, where it would be heated immediately rather than creating cold drafts through the living space. Weber contributed crucial knowledge about air pressure dynamics that Fletcher had been missing. The key principle was that combustion air should enter the cabin at low level near the stove, be heated and rise, then exit through the flue system, creating a predictable circulation pattern. If air entered randomly through multiple leaks, it would create turbulent airflow that could actually reverse the chimney draft and push smoke back into the cabin. Controlled intake through specific vents would ensure steady upward flow that would carry combustion products safely outside. The vent design Weber recommended used a double-wall construction that preheated incoming air to prevent uncomfortable cold drafts. Each vent consisted of an outer opening fitted with a metal scoop that directed air into a narrow channel running along the inside of the wall. This channel allowed outside air to warm slightly from contact with the heated interior wall before entering the living space, reducing the thermal shock of cold air infiltration while still providing the oxygen needed for proper combustion. Fletcher also had to address the problem of excess moisture that accumulated in his tightly sealed cabin. Cooking, breathing, and washing generated water vapor that had nowhere to escape, leading to condensation on windows and walls that could damage his clay plaster and create conditions for mold growth. The solution involved installing a simple but effective moisture exhaust system using a second set of vents positioned near the ceiling level opposite from the combustion air intakes. These upper vents were much smaller than the intake vents and were designed to release humid air without losing excessive heat. Fletcher created them using clay pipes embedded in the wall plaster, with adjustable dampers made from thin wooden slides that could be opened during cooking or other high moisture activities and closed when maximum heat retention was needed. The positioning near the ceiling allowed the natural buoyancy of warm, moist air to drive the ventilation process without requiring mechanical assistance. The most critical aspect of Fletcher's ventilation system was learning to coordinate the intake and exhaust vents with his firing schedule. During the active burning phase, he opened the intake vents wide to ensure vigorous combustion and strong chimney draft, while keeping the moisture exhaust vents closed to prevent heat loss. After the fire died and the thermal mass entered its heat release phase, he could close the intake vents partially to reduce cold air infiltration, while opening the exhaust vents briefly if moisture buildup became apparent. Testing this coordinated system during January's coldest weeks, Fletcher found that proper ventilation management could maintain excellent indoor air quality without compromising the thermal performance he had achieved. His family reported no more problems with smoke, eye irritation, or stuffy air, and the indoor humidity remained comfortable without the excessive condensation that had begun appearing on windows during his early sealed cabin experiments. The ventilation improvements also revealed an unexpected benefit for his cooking activities. With controlled airflow and proper exhaust management, Fletcher's wife could cook on the same stove that heated the thermal mass without filling the cabin with cooking smoke and food odors. The predictable air circulation patterns carried cooking exhaust directly into the flue system, rather than allowing it to spread throughout the living space. By February, Fletcher had achieved a complete integration of thermal mass heating, envelope sealing, and controlled ventilation that provided both superior comfort and excellent air quality. The system maintained indoor temperatures of 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the coldest nights while ensuring that indoor air remained fresh and breathable. Total fuel consumption remained at the dramatically reduced levels he had achieved with thermal mass heating alone, while the addition of proper ventilation had eliminated the air quality problems that could have made the system impractical for daily living. Fletcher's approach had evolved from a simple heating improvement into a comprehensive environmental control system that managed temperature, humidity, air quality, and safety simultaneously, setting the foundation for the severe testing that the approaching winter would provide. The winter of 1875 arrived with a ferocity that caught even experienced frontier settlers unprepared for its duration and intensity. Beginning in mid-November, a series of Arctic air masses settled over the upper Midwest and refused to move, creating a cold snap that would last for 43 consecutive days with nighttime temperatures consistently below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Daytime highs struggled to reach 10 degrees above zero, and on the worst nights, thermometers registered readings as low as minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. This was not the kind of cold that frontier wisdom had been designed to handle, and it would test every heating system in the region to its absolute breaking point. Fletcher's neighbors, still relying on the conventional iron stove approach, found themselves fighting a losing battle against the sustained cold. The Andersons, who had mocked Fletcher's mud bench construction the previous year, were burning wood at a rate that would exhaust their entire winter supply by early February. Despite keeping their stove fired continuously, they woke each morning to interior temperatures in the 20s, with thick frost coating their windows and ice forming in their water buckets. Their children developed persistent coughs from breathing the frigid indoor air, and the family had taken to sleeping in shifts to ensure someone was always awake to feed the fire. The Kowalski family faced even worse conditions. Their smaller cabin and limited wood supply meant they could not maintain continuous fires throughout the night, and they woke several mornings to find their interior temperature had dropped to just 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice had formed on the inside surfaces of their walls, and their stored food supplies were freezing solid despite being kept inside the cabin. Mrs. Kowalski developed frostbite on her fingers from handling the frozen pump handle each morning, and their youngest child showed early signs of hypothermia-related illness. Throughout this same period, Fletcher's integrated heating system performed with remarkable consistency that amazed even him. His evening firing routine remained unchanged from his previous testing, lighting his stove at sunset and maintaining a strong fire for approximately 2.5 hours before allowing it to die completely. The thermal mass absorbed this heat input and radiated it steadily throughout the night, maintaining interior surface temperatures on the bench between 65 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, even during the coldest outdoor conditions. More significantly, Fletcher discovered that his system's performance actually improved during the sustained cold because the thermal mass had time to reach a stable operating temperature. After the first week of extreme cold, the clay and stone structure had absorbed enough heat to establish thermal equilibrium, where the daily heat input exactly matched the daily heat loss. This meant that the bench maintained consistent warmth around the clock, never fully cooling before the next firing cycle began. Fletcher began keeping detailed records during this cold snap, measurements that would later prove crucial for convincing skeptical neighbors of his system's superiority. Using a mercury thermometer borrowed from the town doctor, he recorded indoor air temperatures at 4 different times each day, at sunrise, midday, sunset, and midnight. His logs showed that indoor air temperature never dropped below 47 degrees Fahrenheit, even on the coldest nights, while maintaining an average indoor temperature of 58 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the 43-day period. The fuel consumption data Fletcher compiled was equally impressive. During the worst month of cold, he burned exactly 1 3/4 cords of wood, while his neighbors using conventional heating burned between 5 and 7 cords during the same period. Fletcher's wood consumption was approximately 75% lower than the community average, despite maintaining significantly higher indoor temperatures and better comfort conditions. Fletcher's detailed documentation also revealed performance characteristics that he had not anticipated during his initial design. The thermal mass system created what he called temperature stability, where indoor conditions remained steady regardless of outdoor weather fluctuations. When a brief warming spell raised outdoor temperatures to 20 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days in January, Fletcher's neighbors had to adjust their firing schedules and deal with overheated cabins, while Fletcher's system automatically compensated by storing less heat and maintaining the same comfortable indoor conditions. The breakthrough moment came when Dr. Harrison Mitchell, the traveling physician who served the scattered homestead communities, visited both Fletcher's cabin and several neighboring homesteads during a medical emergency in late January. Dr. Mitchell had been trained at Harvard Medical School and possessed the scientific background to understand and document what he observed. He measured interior temperatures at all the cabins he visited, recorded the health conditions of the families, and noted the fuel consumption rates each household reported. Dr. Mitchell's observations provided the first objective validation of Fletcher's system from a credible outside source. His written report, which he shared throughout the Kasau region, documented that Fletcher's family showed no signs of cold-related health problems, respiratory distress, or the chronic fatigue that affected families in inadequately heated homes. The doctor also noted that Fletcher's cabin maintained humidity levels that prevented the excessive dryness that plagued other winter homes, contributing to better respiratory health and skin comfort. More importantly, Dr. Mitchell understood the economic implications of Fletcher's fuel savings. At current wood prices and labor costs for cutting and hauling, Fletcher's system saved approximately $45 per winter in fuel costs alone, not counting the reduced labor time and the value of better health outcomes. For a frontier family, this represented nearly 2 months of cash income that could be applied to other necessities or improvements. The social turning point occurred in early February when 3 neighboring families approached Fletcher, requesting detailed instructions for building their own thermal mass heating systems. The Larson family, who lived 2 miles upstream, had watched their winter wood supply dwindle to less than 2 weeks remaining and faced the prospect of abandoning their homestead before spring. Fletcher spent several days with them, helping them construct a simplified version of his bench that could be completed quickly using available materials. The rapid adoption of Fletcher's methods by neighboring families provided additional validation that the system was not dependent on Fletcher's particular skills or circumstances. Within 2 years, 7 families in the immediate area had built thermal mass heating systems based on Fletcher's design, with modifications adapted to their specific cabin layouts and available materials. Each installation proved successful, achieving fuel savings of 60 to 75% compared to conventional heating while providing superior comfort and reliability. By 1878, Fletcher's approach had evolved from an individual experiment into a recognized regional building tradition. Newcomers to the area were advised by established settlers to build thermal mass heating into their cabins from the beginning, rather than attempting to retrofit existing structures. The technique had proven itself not as an interesting novelty, but as demonstrably superior frontier technology that could mean the difference between survival and abandonment during severe winter conditions. Fletcher's quiet revolution had established that traditional knowledge, properly understood and applied, could outperform accepted modern methods when those methods were inadequate to the actual conditions they faced.